Hello and welcome back to the Sound of Science. Today we're going to be talking about biochemistry. Biochemistry is dealing with macromolecules and how molecules bond together and how energy is stored in those bonds and what that has to do with living things and their energy requirements. According to Newton's laws, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Instead, energy has to be stored or it has to change form. And for living things, the most important way that energy can be stored is in the form of chemical bonds. Organisms need to use energy for a lot of different reasons, but primarily we're talking about growth and reproduction, organization, and repair of damage. And we need energy in order to do all these things, plus all the additional processes that living things are required to do. In addition, organisms also are going to exchange matter with the environment in order to survive. And that's where macromolecules are going to play a role. These are the molecules of life, the ones we need in order to survive. In general, when we talk about macromolecules in biology, really what we're talking about is four different types of macromolecules, and they are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And in our next video, we're going to talk about all of these and all the properties that they have, but I just want to give you an indicator of the types of elements that we find in these macromolecules. So to begin with, all four of these macromolecules have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Proteins and nucleic acids also contain nitrogen, and lipids and nucleic acids also contain phosphorus, mostly. There are some lipids that are not going to contain phosphorus, but most of them will. Carbon is such a unique element because of the nature of carbon, with the way its electrons are able to bond. It can actually form bonds with other carbons. So carbon to carbon bonds are pretty standard in organic molecules. But carbon is unique in that it can form chains with other carbons, or it can form rings with other carbons, or it can form branches. And I have examples of those there and what they might look like. And this is going to allow carbon to create some pretty complex molecular structures. In addition, the covalent bonds that form between carbons allow them to store energy, and it allows carbon to form most of the basic structures that we find in cells. This makes carbon, truthfully, the most important element for life. Macromolecules form from these subunits called monomers. And truthfully, I just want you to think of monomers like a small portion of a polymer. The polymer is what we would normally consider to be the macromolecule. So if you're thinking of it like the carbons joining together, so maybe carbon rings joining together, this is actually how we get disaccharides, right? We start off with a glucose molecule, which is a nice ring of carbon, and we stick it to another glucose molecule, a nice ring of carbon. And so now we have two glucose molecules side by side. That gives us a disaccharide. Well, the glucose molecule itself would be our monomer. The two stuck together is the polymer. We actually have many stuck together, which is how we would get a molecule called glycogen, which is a starch that's really, really important, particularly in the storage of energy for everyday tasks. These monomers are going to join together through covalent bonds. And when they form, there's this process that takes place called dehydration synthesis, which produces water. On the next slide, I'm going to explain dehydration synthesis and its opposing counterpart, hydrolysis. But make sure you understand the difference between a monomer and a polymer. When two monomers join together, when they bond together, a hydrogen from one of the monomers and a hydroxide, which is just a hydrogen and oxygen together, from the other are going to be kicked off of their bonds. They're going to be removed. And that hydrogen and that hydroxide sort of float around until they run into each other and they're going to bond together to form a water molecule. That's what you're seeing in this top picture here, dehydration synthesis. Now, this is actually the example I just gave. This is a glucose molecule. This is another one. The hydrogen is going to be removed here. The hydroxide is going to be removed here. And this actually opens up a place for a covalent bond to form through this oxygen. Not all monomers are going to have that additional oxygen there, but with carbohydrates, typically that's going to be the case. And then we're going to find our water molecule here. The opposite process is hydrolysis. This is what happens when a polymer is split apart. This is also known as a cleavage reaction because the two molecules are cleaved apart. Clever use of terminology there, huh? So this happens, notice, in the presence of water. Water is required. Think back for a second about water and what we said about water being the universal solvent and see how this sort of makes sense. So this water is required, and the water is able to break itself apart and insert a hydrogen on one, now monomer, and a hydroxide on the other. And that's what we end up with here is back to our two glucose molecules. This is how polymers are detached and monomers are recreated. In this example, we are seeing a protein become cleaved apart. It's going to be separated back into its amino acids. And we can see again, this is hydrolysis. It's happening in the presence of water. Ultimately, it's going to break apart right here. This particular bond is going to pop apart, allowing the hydroxide to attach to this carbon. That's this carbon right here, and allowing that extra hydrogen to attach to this nitrogen right here. Same basic idea, same basic concept, but two amino acids being popped apart. In summary, living things are made of organic molecules such as carbon and hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and one we didn't mention, sulfur. Living things must use energy, which is stored in chemical bonds, and they must exchange molecules with the environment. Monomers bond together using covalent bonds and a process known as dehydration synthesis. This makes polymers. Polymers break apart in a process called hydrolysis to make monomers. That's all I have time for right now. Make sure you go back, get any of the notes that you need. Make sure you're putting your summary on Cornell Notes if that's the style that you're sticking with. And I'll see you next time on The Sound of Science.